Hello and welcome everybody to the Log In Audio Out podcast. I'm here with my co-host Taylor. Say hi, Taylor.
Hello.
And I'm here with a very special guest. Say hi, Justin.
Hi, my name's Justin.
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I work at the Chicago Public Library with Taylor, and I do a lot of swing dancing in my free time, and I've been learning sewing. But what y'all really care about, I think what I'm here to talk about today, is my love of board gaming. So I know y'all tend to do like a favorite video game series. I'd have to be like super basic and just say Smash. But when it comes to favorite board games, if I had to pick only one, it would be a game called Castles of Mad King Ludwig, where you're competing against each other to build the best castle floor plan for this real Bavarian king whose name was Ludwig, who Cinderella's palace is based off of.
I want to play that immediately because I have an obsession with King Ludwig.
Oh, really?
Yeah, went to Neuschwanstein, wrote a giant paper in college comparing two movies about him. It was, okay.
Oh,
I'm gonna play that.
Okay, well,
We'll have to play it soon. Yeah.
Great start, guys. Great start. Well, today's episode topic is going to be a little bit out of my element, but I think I'm glad we have an expert here. It's going to be a topic on board games. So I have a simple question to kind of start off with, considering we are a video game podcast. Board games versus video games. What do you really prefer?
So I would have to say board games. I think that's not to knock video games at all. I think it's partly a product of how I grew up. Is my parents did not want a lot of video games in the household because they turn your mind to mush, as my mom always used to say. So we always had a lot of board games to facilitate family get-togethers. And I didn't get any console that was more advanced than a Game Boy Color until the PlayStation 2, because my mom, who was a doctor, had a patient that lost 40 pounds doing Dance Dance Revolution. So we got a PlayStation 2 just so that we could get Dance Dance Revolution, which she never played. But I've just always been more acquainted with board games. And even now, I don't even have a TV or console.
Really? Wow. Okay. How about you, Taylor?
I was a video game kid. So in my family, I've never really thought about the kind of board games we played, but we definitely played games as a family, like non-video games. But we were sort of like the really classic board games. Like we had Monopoly that everybody hated because it's a terrible game. We were a big Yahtzee family, like just intense Yahtzee playing. Still to this day, my family will bring out Yahtzee. But we were really more about card games. My dad and I played lots of, like, when I was little, Go Fish, and then Crazy Eights, and then this game called Pitch, which not many people know about. It seems to be like a Portland, Oregon thing, the variation of Pitch that my family plays. I have yet to meet someone who knows how to play the variation we play who is not from Portland, Oregon. So that was really kind of like my experience with board games. And I think for me, video games was more like a personal thing that I did that I didn't do as much with my family. I was pretty much of a loner kid. So
same.
It's really easy to play a video game by yourself, but I think board games are really about playing with other people, at least what I've played. So I think that's always been a little bit of a barrier for me to sort of try out all the games that I want to try. But I do love board games. I don't play as much as I want to, mostly because I'm a weird loner.
Well, glad. That's a lot of interesting information I got from you. I'm really happy about that. For me, I am definitely more on the video game aspect, but I think for the same justification as you just had, where I was very much by myself. I didn't have. I was very much a loner kid. I didn't really interact much with my family in that manner. However, in some moments, I think, like the way Justin described it, a lot of board games can be used to gather as a family and just kind of as another source of medium. And to that, I'm barely touching that ground now, which is why I'm glad we're even doing this podcast, because I'm taking a ton of notes on whatever games you guys are mentioning, because I have never heard of them. But no, I think I do think they're both respective in their own rights. However, I will have to say give it to video games a little bit more, in my opinion, because I feel like you can get a lot of similar aspects to as board games will, depending on how you use it. Because like I love playing multiplayer and single player for video games. However, my favorite type of video games are couch multiplayer video games, which essentially I like to call it the fancy version of a board game, if you really think about it. But
yeah, I think of like Mario Party, and like that's basically like, well, it's like board game-esque.
About to say, Mario Party is literally a virtual board game.
Yeah, it does things that like you can't do in an actual board game, but yeah, it's like the closest.
Mm-hmm. Now, I guess it kind of goes into our next question then. It's like, what aspects of board games do you believe separate itself from video games that kind of make it stand out specifically?
Yeah, I think one of the key things is where your visual focus is to some degree. So in a video game, you might, as you kind of y'all were talking about couch games, right? You're all maybe sitting on the couch and all of your focuses are all heading towards that TV screen. It's all in the same place. Whereas in the board game, you're maybe sitting around a table. So your focus may be still on the game, but it's being directed towards the center and towards each other. So as soon as you look up, you're seeing the other person. So I think that one aspect is really it forces a little more of a communal aspect sometimes, because you can't just all stare straight ahead. And I think the other one of the key differences is that, you know, as y'all were saying with like a couch game like Super Mario Party, is most of the mini games that are involved in Super Mario Party all occur in real time, right? So it's, can I blast someone off this thing before Taylor is able to blast them off of this thing? And if Taylor takes too long, then I'm definitely going to do that. Whereas board games, there are some like real-time board games, but most board games tend to be more turn-based. And I think that's also another one of the key differences between the two. So a lot of the board games can sometimes go very heavy on strategy, whereas I feel there are video games that do that, but a lot of video games are also more about quickness and dexterity and kind of the physical abilities rather than just the cerebral parts.
Okay,
interesting.
Yeah, the visual focus thing is really interesting, right? Like you're sort of jumping back and forth between so many different ways of interacting when you're playing a board game. They're like the moments when you're waiting for something else to happen and trying to understand like what the person you're playing with is going to do and why they're doing it. Which you don't, you know, I mean, you get that in video games sometimes, but right, like that aspect of it being turn-based most often in games and sort of like waiting for something to happen, I think is really interesting. There's also just like very simply like the tactile nature of board games that I think really separates it from video games. Something that I love about kind of modern board games, we're sort of like living in a board game renaissance. I don't know exactly when it started, but it did.
We definitely are.
Yeah. And there's just some amazing art, like some amazing game pieces and just like games that are just put together so beautifully and interestingly, that I think if you try to like transfer, and this is sort of like answering a different question, but when you try to transfer that to the virtual, like it doesn't really work as well. Like sometimes I just kind of marvel at all the different elements in a game, and all the little like cool pieces and like interesting way that like boards fit together, or like how the cards are printed and designed. That I really love about modern board games. Yeah.
I'm kind of glad you mentioned a lot of like just the world and just the whole elements of a board game, is because part of, I think, playing a board game, and this is something I've kind of realized recently, is where there's like certain phases of basically you want to play a board game with your friends, and like the first step would be obviously like picking it, and then obviously once you pick the game, so depending on how it can either be a really simple game or a complex game, you have to set up the game. You're essentially your own loading screen where you get to actually like indulge in the elements. Like say a common game I play with my friends, it's called King of Tokyo. It's essentially just a Godzilla kaiju type game where we have to set up a board, shuffle a bunch of power up cards, get your own stand of whatever kaiju you want to be, and then it takes a while before you actually get to start the game because you have to realize you have to go through a certain process. And I think that's much different compared to like say a video game where you're kind of just really just setting. Most you do is like set up controllers and just kind of wait for a loading screen. And I think it's not as much fun. And I think that's kind of a bit of the charm that I think board games have.
Yeah, there's something. So I love deck builders. And I used to play a bunch of Ascension in U Media with Caleb. Shout out to U Media alumni Caleb, who is the best board game player I've ever experienced in my life. He's starting his PhD at Howard, so that just like in math, so that just like gives you a view into Caleb's brain.
Nice.
And something I noticed, because sometimes we would play Ascension, the physical game Ascension, and sometimes we would play it on the iPad, the digital version. And when you play a board game and like its physical version, like you're the one having to do the math and keep everything straight and keep the rules in your head and make calls about the rules and interpretations about the rules. Whereas video games, like, because they are written programs, like lead you through it. So I do really like how active your brain is throughout the process of playing a board game.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think that's actually a very funny moment of just understanding the game itself. Because you mentioned prior when you're playing a video game, a lot of the programs kind of run on their own where you're basically just doing whatever the game allows you to do. Whereas in a board game, technically speaking, there's kind of anything goes out the window. And it's up to you and the other players to kind of determine, is this the right call? Is this the right rule? And it makes the first attempt really complicated, but sometimes it's kind of fun because you don't really get that experience a lot.
And you can also like modify the game in a way that you want to.
That is actually a good point.
Yeah, it's kind of like how society works a little bit, right? Like you're like, okay, these are the rules that have been given to us, but it is our job to fulfill the rules and hold them. And there could be that one person who you don't like to play with who might, could cheat in a way they couldn't in a video game to get ahead, which, ruins the fun of it. But also there is that option of, oh, well, we got that rule wrong, so it was a totally different game, but we were all operating by that same wrong rule. Or, as Taylor was alluding to, like house rules can really change the way you play games, especially with, talk about Monopoly. Everyone seems to have their own house and family rules for Monopoly. But
don't get me started on Uno.
Oh,
right. Yeah. Uno is another one with the
there have been so many fights
rules
in U Media over people's various Uno rules.
But there was a great article, I think it was The Onion, where it was something like, Area Man keeps explaining, I promise, this game will be fun, as they take 25 minutes to explain the rules to Ticket to Ride. Every so often, I find myself doing it too. I'm like, I know it sounds like a lot. It's going to be really fun. Just bear with me. Just 4 more rules left. Whereas a video game will often kind of ease you into it, and it'll kind of like teach you the rules every time you play it, whether you want it to or not.
My question is, would you kind of see that as like a positive or a negative then? If like the accessibility or like the learning curve is kind of steep at times?
Yeah, that does make some games hard. Like there's a game I love called Agricola. There's another one called Scythe, and they're so fiddly that like when you're playing it the first time, you're not going to win. You just have to accept, I'm not going to win this, because it is only by the end of the game that I will have understood how I was supposed to play it. So that does create, for sure, a little bit of a barrier. And if you don't like retaining a lot of rules and things like that, you're not going to enjoy them. I pretty much never read the instructions for a game. I will watch a how to play video. I'll watch a how to play video online, because some of these instructions can be 30 pages. And if you haven't seen the gameplay, you're like, oh, what is this term they're using for a card? Oh, they're calling these magics. Oh, okay. Like, so I'll just watch a playthrough, and then I'm usually the one to teach it to my friends, because none of them want to bother watching a 30-minute video or trying to puzzle through the rule book.
I want to say I relate to you in many ways, because I'm actually I play that role a lot, because I buy a lot of the board games for my friends, and I'm always the one trying to figure out, does this happen? Does this happen? And then to play on what we talked about earlier with house rules, even like some rulings that I get wrong, no one's gonna question me on it. It looks complicated enough as it is. I'm like, if you want to question me, read the book, and when we debate the next 10 minutes on figuring out who's right, who's wrong.
Yeah,
right.
I also, sorry.
Oh no, I love the role of the person who's really good at teaching board games. Which is also just like a thing unique to board games that is not like a video game thing. My friend's husband, who's a middle school teacher, is the best at teaching board games. It's like he can make the most complicated game seem so simple and easy, even if it's really complicated. And right, like if you're someone who's interested in like education and explaining things, and like I think it's just a cool like skill to flex to try to teach someone else a board game, and that's something you don't get in video games.
Well, yeah, and I think it kind of also goes into like another positive for why people should play board games in some aspects is it increases some type of social skill, where you're not just playing against a computer, where technically speaking, there's not really a board game you can really play by yourself, or there's not that many. And I think that kind of forces the interactivity between you and someone else, and how well your communication skills and social skills can work. Because depending on how well they are, is going to then resolve into, are you going to enjoy this game or not?
And it's not just about how well can you explain something so that you would be able to understand it, but it's also about understanding how do other people receive information. Because there's two general umbrellas, which is some people want to hear every single rule up front. And then there's other people who are like, I just want the general roadmap, and you'll teach me the rest as we go, and I'm just going to learn as I play it. So you kind of also have to learn to balance. Are they an all up front person? Is it a learn as we go? And for some people, they really need the intentionality. It doesn't help them to say, oh, if you discard this, then you can draw two of these, and then you can do this, and then you can do this. They want to know the intentionality of like, what is the reasoning behind why you would make certain actions, instead of just, here is the menu of action. So it's very much about understanding other learning styles, and then balancing that when there's 3 or 4 other people at the table, each with their own learning style, going back to what Taylor was saying about teaching.
Interesting. Okay. But, I think that's a really interesting take on it. I guess this will kind of go into our next question is, why would someone be more inclined to play an IRL or in real life board game compared to an online, or I guess even regular video game? And because I know technically the first question kind of touched on that a little bit, but if there's any other way you'd want to further elaborate.
So I sometimes if I'm like hanging out with a group of friends, I don't always know, like it sometimes seems like everyone just wants to sit around and just talk about things. And I'm like, I don't know, what is there left to say? So anytime I go to like a party or something with friends, even if it's like a party where there's gonna be like 30 people, I always bring like 4 or 5 board games with me, because there's always other people there who also want to not just sit around and talk. And so in some ways, like, yes, board games take up more physical space, but they're also more transportable, right? You're not dependent on the host having the right console with the right number of controllers. You can just bring your games, and I just say, who wants to play a board game? And then we can do it. And it's a way to like hang out with people and not have to talk, but you can if you want to. So that's kind of my primary way I end up like hanging out with people.
So you use board games as like a form of icebreakers.
Yeah, as icebreakers, or just like as the main event.
No, I completely understand. I'm the same way. I think we kind of just want to do something, and it's like kind of like it's another form of like of socializing that I think makes it easier for everyone. Because I mean, who doesn't love just playing a game and just kind of like getting immersed into it? Because everyone likes the feeling of winning or losing or just participating, really.
Yeah. So I got into board games working in new media, teen space at the library. We bought a bunch of board games. I had a coworker, Jamie, and they were really into board games and brought in some things. And we would play them with a group of teens in the space. And I learned so much about board games from Jamie. And then Jamie moved. I'm sad. Still miss them, but they're an awesome teen librarian in Arizona now. But I kind of realized in the context of working in new media, where we have teens coming from all across the city of Chicago, that board games were a really good way for people who didn't know each other to really easily start talking to each other through playing with each other. And after a while, we had this regular Sunday group, and we would do Sundays because the space was really quiet and the games would take a long time to set up. The favorite was Zombicide, which is a very fun co-op game, but it takes a long time to set up. And it was just this moment of realizing like, oh, this is a way to sort of like ease social interaction. And get to know someone that you don't know over this, process of learning and playing a game together. And I think especially co-op games, I'm really excited that there are more co-op board games. Like, I just don't remember that being a thing when I was a kid of like, let's work together rather than compete against each other.
And I'm glad you brought up that specific topic of just having like people just showing up to a certain amount of time while it's quiet, because one of the fun aspects that I see for board games is like the environment around it, or that it causes, where a lot of it tends to be like really peaceful, or it can be really loud. But a lot of times you don't really get the same type of environment with your video games. It's always like something energetic, loud sounds, music. Everyone's kind of like hyped in some aspects, trying to win, where honestly, I think a board game doesn't really need all that, where you can just play a simple, quiet board game, or just have a chance to really just, because it encourages thought, like thinking and focus. And I'm not saying video games don't also need that at times, but I think board games would benefit a lot more, or that they do benefit more from that. And I think it just shares like another point of like quality time with other people, where people look forward to wanting to play this game again, where they want to have the same group of people again. It's like, I think why, I'm not sure if this qualifies as a board game. I guess Dungeons and Dragons would qualify as that. And it's why people would constantly do campaigns with a certain group and just constantly go week after week and participating in it.
Yeah. And another thing I as you were saying that, I sort of realized like there are a lot of board games that have like performative aspects to them that I'm really hard pressed to think of any video games outside of like Jackbox and those sort of party games that are very similar to board games that have that much of a performative aspect that let you sort of like be creative and play a role, from D&D to, like apples to apples.
Yeah. And there's even kind of a fairly newer trend is, since you're talking, Hugo, about like the same group constantly coming together for the board games, is there's a fairly new genre called legacy games. So for example, there's a game called Pandemic, which it's a co-op game about virulent strains of disease. It actually got super popular. It had a re-emerging
I wonder why
popularity at the beginning of COVID, before people realized, oh, this is like a real and serious thing that's happening. But like you can play the regular Pandemic, and then it's like the same rules, and then each game will be slightly different based on like how certain cards come out. But there's also a Pandemic Legacy, which is played over 12 to 24 sessions, ideally with the same group of people. And depending on how the previous game ended, it might direct you to rip up certain cards or to add certain stickers on the board, so that as you're playing this legacy game, the game itself is changing, and there's kind of this storyline that is now developing. And so Pandemic Legacy has one. They have a Risk Legacy. Betrayal on House of the Hill has a legacy version now, where like the game will shift. And that's, I haven't personally played any of those, but you really like, it's about getting that core group. And then maybe every month you're all like, all right, let's do the next phase of this. And let's see where this game that we know and love takes us next in ways we don't expect.
Interesting. I've never heard of, like, I guess, legacy versions of games. I think that's a fun twist compared to like what the norm would kind of think of what board games are. Okay, I guess I kind of want to go into my next question. As time goes on, we've kind of realizing as tech has gotten more and more advanced, you'd think that people would mainly focus on electronical aspects such as just pure video games. Only really want to do that. Anything like IRL in person is like, oh, the thing of the past. Yet what Taylor mentioned previously is like there's been a renaissance kind of popping up for board games again. I was wondering if you had like any intake on that, on why they're essentially still retaining, if not increasing in popularity now, despite like the pandemic happening and social distancing becoming more of a thing.
Well, I think part of it is, right, there is so much screen stuff everywhere. Like we all got our Black Mirrors now, that sometimes it's nice to go away from that and to do something a little more lo-fi. I mean, I don't know a ton about video games, but I assume that's why the Untitled Goose Game, part of the reason it was so popular is it was so different from all the like high-tech production value. It's just like, oh, here's just like a fun little game, super lo-fi, and you can just go for it and do it. And I think it'll be interesting to see, like, as more people are starting to meet in person, how will screens play into that? Are people going to be like, all right, screens have been such a big part of our life, now it's an even bigger part? Or are people going to say, you know what, let's do less screen time even? And I think that is definitely one of the reasons board games are popular. My guess, I don't know the economics of it all, but I would assume board games are much cheaper to produce than a video game, just because of all the labor that goes into creating like graphics and things like that. Whereas a board game is probably, my guess is it would be cheaper to produce, so that you're also able to like have more of them being turned out, and they don't have to have necessarily the same blockbuster appeal that a video game has in order to recoup value. And so it's able to cater to more niche interests.
No, I think it's a very good point. And sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, by the way.
No, I was done.
Before you mentioned specifically on why some people are kind of paying attention to what kind of stands out instead of like just trying to get away from like the big production norms, that is exactly the reason why certain video games tend to be more popular. Specifically, what you mentioned, Untitled Goose Game. At this time, a lot of indie games tend to take a lot bigger popularity from like big AAA titles, because it's kind of all the same thing every single year, and people want something different because maybe you want something that's very story heavy. Maybe you want something that plays a very different way, where it's like, oh, wow, I didn't think about it that way. And I think that's kind of what board games are kind of serving now, where if we're also going in our current times, people want to socialize more than ever, because we're all stuck inside our houses. We all want to do more things. And to piggyback on what Taylor said previously about Jackbox Ticket was a very different type of video game at the time it came out, where it's a game that requires almost no controller because everyone uses a tablet or a phone, and that encourages socializing between the TV, yet it's technically an online game. And people found a way through video games to kind of socialize together, even if they're so far away. And it's one of the very few instances on why it's like it got so popular. And then another one is like Among Us, where it's basically a fancy form of Mafia or Werewolf, which is a very old, like, I wouldn't call it a board game, but it's definitely like a classic type. Exactly. And I think it got so popular then because people just want to socialize, and it provided that like, I guess, craving that people wanted to be satisfied. And there's actually a very good mix of a video game and board game that I'd recommend. It's called Tabletop Simulator. Ironically, the name is kind of very straightforward. You can basically play any type of board game or card game online, where it's like a regular program that's able to run any kind of video game, or not video game, any kind of board game, where you could just upload your own files, or throw in inanimate objects. Basically, you can play a board game without necessarily having to be there. And I have a love-hate relationship for it, only for the sake of it doesn't feel like a board game, but it is.
Yeah, definitely like a game that exists in like the physical world.
Oh yeah.
Right. It's not like doing the work for you. You actually have to like know the rules and follow the rules, right? Like there are a bunch of like publishing issues and rights issues with Tabletop Simulator, which you probably don't want to get into. But it's a real, I think, interesting way of thinking about how you would like port the video game experience or the board game experience to a video game.
And I think it has some like licensing rights aside. I think it's a good way if you want to play games that you don't really have the luxury of seeing people. Like say you have friends who live like across the country or like a different side of the globe, but you can. This gives you an ability to kind of interact with them. You don't as if you wouldn't normally. And the only con I have, of course, is like it's the same function if you're trying a board game for the first time. Of you're kind of zoned out. You're not really paying attention, and it's kind of hard to to learn how to play the game. Whereas if you already knew the game, you kind of know what everything does. It's pretty straightforward. It's kind of like you kind of know the game like the back of your hand. And because the thing is like you don't really see anybody's faces. You don't see like a physical board. You can't really feel anything. It's just a bunch of like you're just using your mouse and clicking back throughout the screen. And I think that is the really only con where it kind of sucks the life out of board games, in my personal opinion. But I have a bunch of friends who love it and play it constantly. But if I could recommend any type of mix between board game and video game, that would be it. But however, I do have a simple question on what would you really recommend in terms of playing a board game of like, say, Monopoly or Uno, to where they have video game alternatives?
Oh, like if a board game has been turned into, it has a digital version of it.
Yeah. Specifically, like say like Monopoly, where it's like Ubisoft tends to own a lot of licensing properties for board games. Yeah. To where they're constantly on Switch, they're constantly on Steam and stuff like that.
I love Ascension. I don't know that it's the best. I play it a lot. It's my favorite deck builder, so I play it a lot. But I think the best that I've played, and I actually played the mobile version of this game before I played the board game, is Space Team. Space Team is super, super fun. And it's been a while since I play it, but you're on a spaceship, everything's fallen apart. It's a co-op game. You're playing with other people and you have different roles. And so when you're playing it on the phone, and that's how I played it first, I played at a party with my friends and you pass the phone around. So it's like, okay, this has to happen. Okay. All right. I did it. I passed it to like the person who has this role. They're going to do this. Sometimes you have to do something together or you have to like shake the phone. So you also do that in the physical game. It's a set of cards. So you're like passing cards, doing these things together. You have to communicate with one another. I played this once with someone you all know, Marcus, who's a lovely person, lovely librarian, sometimes not the best communicator. It was utter absolute chaos. And it's really, really fun. But there was something about playing the mobile version of it and like the act of passing the phone that was really fun. And I think kind of figured out a way of taking the original card version of it and making it fit mobile. That was really smart. I highly recommend Space Team. There are a bunch of expansion packs that I haven't played, but I really want to.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. What I also like about that is they really from the way you've described, they've really embraced the mobile format. Instead of just trying to simply recreate it, instead they're capturing the idea of what the game is about and then fitting it for that medium, that sounds very cool. Also, like a lot of trust in like handing your phone off to various people and like hoping like nothing happens. But I love that.
That's technically what's. I see another example is like Heads Up. If you guys have ever heard of that version, I don't know how to describe it. It's like charades, I guess, or it's like they have to do a certain action where someone holds a phone to their forehead, and then there's a group, any group of other people have to describe the whatever the topic is on the phone to the person who's holding the phone because they can't look at what the prompt is. And more or less, like you have to go through as many prompts. It's like, oh, is it this? Is it like Winnie the Pooh? Is it like something pop culture, like a superhero movie, etc.? I don't know. I know I gave like a really terrible description, but I think it's like what Justin was saying a lot is I think a lot of companies are incorporating a lot of mobile-esque methods to create a pseudo video game, board game-ish type of experience. And I think they're just trying to make a board game with as little of game pieces as possible to make it as accessible.
Yeah, that Heads Up game has gotten me through many a long wait at the airport. And like if you're at like a Six Flags or something and you're waiting in line for a while, it's really great for that when you're all just like standing there for 20 minutes. And sometimes strangers will join too when you do that, which is also really interesting dynamic when that happens.
Awesome. Okay. I guess let's go into our last big question. Oh, sorry.
Sorry. I realized I should make a clarification because I was looking up Space Team as we were talking. You don't actually pass your phone. I think we just passed our phones because someone's phone wasn't working. So you don't actually pass your phone. Now that I was like looking at the rules. But there's a lot of shouting, which is fun. So Great. That still holds true.
Awesome. Okay, I guess let's transition into our last big question. What games would you really recommend to someone who'd be wanting to host an IRL game night with their friends?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many options. I think like the first thing is to figure out like what is their purpose of the game? Like, is it just a way for people to hang out and have fun? And is it going to be with people who are like, I don't really like board games. And if it has more than 4 rules, I'm going to be very lost. In that case, I really recommend there's a game called Just One where, so like, let's say it's Taylor's turn. She's going to have a card that says elephant on it. She can't see it, but all of us can see it. And we all have to write down a 1-word clue that would get Taylor to guess elephant. But if 2 people write trunk, Taylor will not get to see the word trunk. So it's encouraging you to like sort of anticipate what other people might write, perhaps go a little esoteric. But if everyone goes esoteric, then Taylor's like, I have like gray peanut, like what, so that can be a great one for people who don't love board games or are kind of more ambivalent about them. It's also great because it's a communal game. So it doesn't matter if someone shows up late. You can be like, oh yeah, come on, just join in, instead of, yeah, we'll be done. It's just gonna be like 25 more minutes. We're on the second to last round. You know what I mean? So like things like that. I mean, Taboo is also great. Codenames is a really good one where Codenames is 2 teams and it's a word association game. But if people are like wanting to do more strategy-based games, so those are kind of more in the party game vibe, which can be fun, and I like them. I tend to lean more towards the strategy games myself. Like, give me like a 2.5 hour, 3 hour Feast for Odin, and I'm like, oh yes, let's do that. For a lot of people, they don't want to spend 3 hours on a board game, but kind of some more beginner level strategy games. There's one called Azul, which is a tile placement game. So that one's not too difficult to learn, and it only takes about 30 minutes to play. So Azul is like a really good one of those types. Ticket to Ride and Catan, I feel like, are also some of the like, for people who like the strategy board games, or they're sometimes called Euro games, Catan and Ticket to Ride are still 2 of the classics. Personally, I feel that there are better games that have come along since those 2, but those were pioneers in the field. And I've got to do a quick little digression. I'm sorry, Hugo. But so I called them Euro games because a lot of these games that I'm talking about, like the strategy games like Catan and all of those, were developed in Europe and especially Germany. And it was because when you play Monopoly, it's all about you win because you have crushed everyone else into oblivion. Risk, you have crushed everyone else into oblivion. And like post World War II, the idea of crushing all your enemies into oblivion was like a little bit of a problematic mindset to have. So like a whole new style of gaming got created called the Euro game, where it wasn't, you don't win in Catan because you bled the other person dry. You just had a better settlement than the other person had. Or Ticket to Ride, you just had a better rail system than the other person had. It's not that you bought out their rail system. So I just had to do that digression because it's a fascinating history on why these new strategy games got developed. And it was because of like weird issues with war and like fascism and hegemony. But those are some, I think, good ones, like Azul, Ticket to Ride, Catan, if you're looking for a little strategy based. Taboo, Code Names, Just One can be some good like party games. Or if you're having a board game night, I like to start with one of those because then as people are still coming, they can join in. And then you're like, okay, now that everyone's come, okay, we got 9 people, so we can have a 4-person game and a 5-person game. Let's figure out what we're going to do now.
No, I actually think it's really amazing that you brought that up because I was actually about to ask, like, what is a Euro game? Because I feel like that's a new type of edge, I guess, subgenre that I've never heard of. And I think now that you've kind of told me what it is, it makes me look at a lot of the current board games that I play. That's like, this is oddly violent. and I think it's definitely a new light on. I didn't think the history of board games would kind of go for it because I think in terms of like the class, if you could think of like the most classic or oldest type of board game there is chess, which in reality is just simulated war. And I think that's just an interesting topic to go on in terms.
And there's
of
nothing wrong with necessarily a little bit of war and aggression.
Yeah, there are just other ways to play and interact with people. I'll say Ticket to Ride was the only game I could get my parents, my boomer parents, on board with like kind of newer style board games. They're very much, let's play Yahtzee for the 10 millionth time, but they love Ticket to Ride. So I think it's a really accessible one. And there's a reason it's a classic. I love it too. Also, I just really like maps. So
yeah,
it appeals to me.
Yeah, and I'm so very glad, Justin, you brought up the topic of like, depending on what kind of people you have to play with impacts what kind of game you're willing to do. Because some people just don't have a lot of attention span to go for a giant type of campaign-ish game, or to like, of course, what we talked about earlier, willing to sit through a bunch of rules and just be like, what can I do? Do I play now? Do I do this? Do I do that? And maybe sometimes a party game is kind of the way to go. And I guess there's some, I like to think there's some gateway games that I think that can still classify as party games, but at the same time can also have some level of depth in it. Where this is going to go for one of my recommendations. It's a very simple game. It's a tile placement game. It's called Suro, where it's essentially there's different versions, but the original version focuses on everyone being a set of a dragon, where you place tiles along specific paths, and your objective is to stay on board for as long as you can. Where during each turn you have a different hand of tiles, and you place it on the board. That's where your dragon progresses, and eventually you're gonna fall off the board. You might interact with other players. It's a really simple game of just last one standing. And way to make that complex is there's another version of that exact game where instead of dragons, it's ships, like sea ships and boats. And it could either play like this the regular simple way as the original, or you can add an extra element of adding sea monsters or other type of like weather environments. And I think that's like a good entry level to feel like this can be a game that anyone can pick up. But if you really put more time and effort, you can get to an entirely different experience.
I thought it was interesting when Justin was kind of talking about like how to do a game night and having some variety within a game night. Like some of the best experiences that I've had playing games is, you might try one game, find it's not like quite hitting the crowd, like let's switch to another game, like really finding the right game for the audience and kind of like switching up the way you're using your brain too over the course of an evening playing games. Some of my best like experience gaming have been game nights like that, where we start with something like simple and short, and then move on to something like bigger and more complicated. A game that a great game night that is like 2 years ago now, because I haven't had like a full game night in forever because of COVID. But we started off playing a game called Skull, which is a beautiful game. It's got like, they're almost like coaster pieces that you flip over and cards, and they've got calaveras on them, just like absolutely beautifully illustrated. Such a good looking game. And it's all about kind of bluffing and lying. So it's really easy to understand the rules, but you can replay it and kind of have a different experience every time you play, depending on who you're playing with and like how they're shifting their strategy and how you understand their strategy. It's really, really fun. And then we ended that game night playing, and I wish I could remember the name of it, but right, escape rooms are huge now, and now there's kind of like the board game card game version of that. So we played a game like that, that was just a set of cards, but it was like a single use board game. So it's like you're going to play it once and then that's it. And it was really cool because at points, like, to solve the puzzles, you had to like cut the cards and like fold them into shapes and kind of like manipulate the pieces. It was very hard. We were very tired when we played it. It was 4 of us playing it. My friend spilled wine over all of the cards towards the end of the game. So that was fun. By the time we were like absolutely exhausted playing it, but it was really fun. It was very much the spirit of escape room, solve the puzzle. And it also, I think that a lot of modern board games are doing this too, incorporated mobile into the game, where like you could watch a video like partway through, or like you scanned a code to like look something up. So it did that well too. I really wish I knew the name of it. It might have been.
Was it Unlock with an exclamation point by chance? Because I know I've done some with people. I mean, there's a bunch of them that are coming out now, but there's one where it's like Unlock, and it's single use. But then, so my friends would buy it, they would play it, and then they would gift it to their friends. So it was one like, even though you paid for it, you can kind of circle them around, or like everyone in your group buys one of them, and then you can circulate.
I think it's also a fun idea that you also just brought up, like, on accident. People are still coming up with brand new types of board games to this very day. And honestly, like, one of my stigmas, I thought it's like you can only kind of reinvent the wheel so many times that I feel like there isn't much you can do with board games, because I just think video games are the way to go. The possibilities are endless. But no, I think that's not the case for board games as well, because I think there's still a lot of ingenuities you can come up with. Because I'm still finding new games I love to play. Like, I just found one about like cats, where it's called I can't remember. It's literally like I have it right with me at the current. It's called Too Many Poops. I understand the title is very little bit vulgar, but it's essentially about maintaining your own.
That's an amazing title.
Cats.
No, I just played that for the first time, like last month.
At a convention where it's like the guy I met the creator. I met the creator at a convention. He taught me how to play it, where it's essentially everyone just maintaining their own type litter of cats. And like, you can either adopt them from a store, find them find strays, and you have to and each cat tends to interact differently with other types of cats. And they essentially function as a point system. However, the more cats you have, obviously creates a lot of feces. And that's obviously that's actually how you lose the game. You collect too many, you're out. And it's essentially like it's a fun balance between of like a simple yet very complex game. And I think I would have never in a million years thought I'd buy a game about cats and managing themselves. And that it just brings a smile on my face, you know?
Yeah, and this is something I really wish that the video game world would embrace a little more, is that, right, in board game world, your game is only as good as the gameplay, because there's really nothing to hide behind. I mean, yes, you can make it look beautiful, but you know, people are only going to care so much that you've made the cards look really nice or made the board look really nice. Like, unless the gameplay is fun and engaging and has a certain level of challenge and just general engagement, you're not going to go with it. Video games have a lot to hide behind. Like they've got graphics, they've got music, they've got all this other stuff where I think players have become much more accepting of tropes and very repetitive styles of playing games. That I wish that, but it's also, and we've talked about this too, I think it's harder to make a video game, and not necessarily in terms of like design. I think it's very, very difficult to design a good balanced board game, but in terms of like money, effort, just the whole physical ordeal of making a video game, it's harder, which is maybe why you don't see as much experimentation in the medium. But I really, that's something I really love about board games. Just like there does seem to be just the spirit of like, how do we find new interesting ways to play things?
And there have been board games that have honestly, this will sound really dorky, but it seems like this is the podcast for it. There are board games that have really changed the way in which I view and understand the world. Like one of them, it's a game called Diplomacy, which is like Risk if you took away all of the luck and dice rolling, where you are trying to control a certain amount of World War I Europe, but you only have 3 troops to do it. And so if Taylor and I both try to move into Paris and we're on opposite sides, we will bounce out because it's a 1-to-1 ratio. But I could say, hey, Hugo, will you support my troop going into Paris? And then later I will support you in this other battle because like the two of us need to overtake Taylor and blah, blah, blah. So you might then support me into it. Now it's 2-to-1. I am in there. Taylor has not been able to go there. But you might be on Taylor's team and say yes to me and tell Taylor, I'm going to tell Justin, I'm going to support him going into Paris. I'm actually going to support you going into Paris. And I don't know that those conversations have happened because everyone's been talking in corners. And it really, like in playing that game, one, it made me realize I never want to be a diplomat, but it really like completely encapsulated how the act of diplomacy functions. Or there's one called Evolution where you are playing as animals and you are trying to get limited food. And so you can add on abilities like burrowing to protect yourself from predation or climbing to be able to escape predation. Or you can play as a carnivore. Of course, you can only eat animals that are smaller than you unless you add on abilities like pack hunting. And then if you hunt as a pack, you can overwhelm animals that are larger than you. And so games like that and like Diplomacy have really, I think like some of them have just really found ways to embody that like interpersonal or just thematic ways of gamifying life that I love.
Diplomacy sounds so much like an exercise that my AP European history teacher had us do. He was also the best teacher I've ever had in my life. Mr. Kucharski, high school history teacher. He was the best. But yeah, he had us like basically like enact like the Treaty of Versailles. Like we were diplomats. We all had like a certain number of resources and we all had to, put something together that was going to make everybody happy without knowing like what the other conversations you were having were. And my main memory of that was that, I'm sorry, this is a tangent, but I just like, I loved this exercise in school. I don't remember what country I was. I was like some tiny country that had no resources, had nothing to offer anyone in the world. But somehow I like schmoozed my way into like getting everything I wanted because I was just like handing out, like I was just being ridiculous. And when we like finally presented what we were doing to the class, our teacher was like, what the hell happened here? Like that, well, okay, welcome to diplomacy. Like sometimes this is how it works. Someone has nothing but talks their way into everything.
No, and I think you brought up a good point even with that tangent. It's a lot of board games that we currently enjoy have to derive from some form of communications and socializing, where it's whether it's simulating war or some real life event, or literally just maintaining a bunch of cats or just having something a mystical adventure. I think it's a very good point. Unfortunately, we are kind of running out of time. This has been really great. If you have any like closing points or anything you'd want to say, I guess now would be the time to say it. All right.
Just got overwhelmed with the final word on board games. I don't know. Just play something. Go play something. Try something new.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You can always, there's a lot of great, YouTube can be a great resource. People who have made like guides for like intro to gaming or best intermediate games. So if you're like, oh, I kind of want to play, but I don't know what to play, those can be great resources. Depending on where you live, like if you live in Chicago, there's a bunch of board game stores and cafes. They're still not necessarily doing the in-person stuff right now, but like a place up north in Edgewater called Dice Dojo, every Wednesday would have free gaming there. You just show up, you pull down one of the literally over 1,000 board games they have on their shelves and play for free. Or there was a bonus round cafe near like the Belmont Red and Brown line stop, and you could just, it was a cafe and a board game place, and the staff there will be like, oh, here, we think you'll like this game. Come and play it. So there's a lot of opportunities of places to try it out even before you buy it. And it's not just Chicago that has that. A lot of places are starting to have board game cafes now where you can do those sorts of things.
Yeah. And just to go a little bit on my shout out, I actually go to a lot of these shops as well. I call them card shops, but they're technically also just regular gaming shops as well, where they both like IRL types of games. I go to this one in Chicago, like it's called Gamers World, and all the way in like the Water Tower. At the time of this recording, that's where it's located. I go there a lot. I've met tons of great people there. I've gotten a handful of board games there. I love the place. It's always a fun time. And like what Justin reiterated, they're kind of all over the place, and they're just a great place that encourage a safe place if you want to play something IRL. And all right then, though. Thank you so much, Justin. You've been a phenomenal guest.
Thanks for having me. I love talking about board games.
Awesome. Do you have any like last things you want to say to the audience before we go?
Play a game. And the library has games too. So pretty soon that stuff's going to start opening up, and we can be another resource for you to play. Library has plenty of things. And if you like role-playing games, we also have like D&D and Pathfinder rule books. So if you're like, we want to do this, but we don't, because those books are expensive, let me tell you. And if you don't want to spend $70 for that book for the one time you're going to use it, check it out from the library. We have it.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you so much for this time. You've been great. All right. Without further ado, I guess we'll call this to a close. Thank you everyone for listening. Have a good night, good day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.